All right, in this final video in the generic section, we're going to do this week 1 playing. And what this is just getting used to Photoshop's interface a little bit more. I do have in the Meka at Macomb site, I do have a Photoshop area, and I do have a Photoshop walkthrough. Here's the hotkeys. These are PC, but you can adjust them for the Mac. So I definitely recommend watching that. It's a short video. And it just walks through just some basics of the interface itself, okay? I'm just going to create a new document and go through some of the basics of what we're looking at, okay? So obviously I clicked on this Create New. That's the same thing as File New, okay? So there's no difference there. This is the new document window that pops up. These are all presets, so you can obviously pick from a preset if you need to. Most of the time I just type my stuff in. Unless I'm not sure about, if I'm going to, let's say, film and I'm not sure which resolution I should use, maybe I'll pick one from there. But typically I just type it in. Right now we're dealing with pixels. We have in Photoshop, in imagery on the computer, we have this thing called pixels, which are the tiny dots that make it up, that make up every image. If I go here and I open up an image of something else, there we go, and I hit Control and Spacebar, that's my magnifier here, and I click and drag, there we go, I can zoom in to an area and you can see all the pixels that make up this image, okay? So when we are looking at this new image and we're looking at this as a pixel count, it's basically allowing us to see how many pixels across this image is and how many pixels vertically. If we have a low resolution, so let's say we have 20 pixels by 20 pixels, and I hit Create, number one, you can see how tiny that is, but I can still zoom in, okay, so I can still see there's my document. If I go in here to my brush and I just choose the default round brush, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger by hitting the brackets on the keyboard, and I click, you can see how disgusting that is, okay? So if you see this kind of thing, it basically means like you don't have enough pixels to actually draw any kind of detail. If you think of like the 8-bit characters, I don't know what that is, 8-bit do. From years and years ago, and they're kind of making a comeback now. These were basically just like individual pixels, okay, that went around to create these characters that made them look like that, okay. We've evolved past that, especially when we're looking at Photoshop, so it's very rare that we would do something like this unless it was to kind of recreate that kind of 8-bit character look. Let's go back to new again. So typically we're going to deal with some sort of pixels. Now, if we're doing something for a TV screen, we may have this at, let's say, 1920 pixels by 1080, because the resolution for a 1080p is 1920 by 1080. Sometimes we'll double it, so 3840 by 2160. Okay, so that's double that previous one. Just because it's the same resolution, basically it's just, or same proportions, just bigger. And sometimes we'll do different things depending on what we want. Let's say that we're going to print something on a 4x6 card. So I'm going to go to inches, and I have a 4" by 6". So that's what this is. Now, this other part of the resolution, this is where we control how many dots per inch we still have. So we could have 4 inches by 6 inches, but if this resolution is still too tiny, that's not going to give us any amount of detail, okay? And you'll see this is pixels per inch, and there's also pixels per centimeter. So these pixels here and these inches there, you'll see they're related. If I change this to 300, that means that it's going to take 4 inches times 300. If I switch this, I should get 1200. Yep. And then this was 6 inches, now it's 1800. Okay? So the more resolution you have, the bigger this number, the more detail you can add. But depending on what you're doing with it, it may be overkill. If I'm going to put this on a 4x6, and I'm going to print it on a regular inkjet printer, and I went to, let's say, 25,000 pixels per inch, my printer cannot print 25,000 pixels in an inch. So that would be overkill. Typically, I would go with, let's say, 300, and that is sufficient. All right, so this is the size of our document. If we're printing it, I typically deal in inches. If I'm going to use it on a screen, typically I'll deal in pixels. 600 by 500. The RGB color. So RGB means red, green, blue, and that's typically something you would see on a screen. So if you're using an image on a screen, that's where the RGB would be valuable. If I'm going to use this image and print it, then I would want to work in a CMYK. So an image that I took on my camera is an RGB image, but when I put it on my computer and then I wanted to set it up to print, I'd want to switch it over to a CMYK so I can see closer what it's going to look like. You may see very little difference. You may see a huge difference in what these two things do. Okay, we'll get into some of those a little bit later, but anything we're going to print, we do CMYK. Anything for screen, we're going to do RGB. This is just screen. Screwing around, we'll just put RGB. Our background is white or black or pick a color. That's just what that background is going to be. And then this is how deep our pixels are. So each one of our pixels stores data. So let's hit create for a second. And I'm going to go to my brush. I'm going to paint, and I'm going to zoom in. Okay. So each one of these tiny little dots that's a pixel is storing some kind of information. Ideally, in the blackest area, there should be the values of 0, 0, 0. In the whitest areas, there should be values of 1, 1, and 1. Okay, so I'm going to go to my info, which is F8, but that's another hotkey that I have assigned something else, so I'm just going to pull it up and dock this over here. And as I move my mouse into this area, you'll see that my white is actually 255. Okay, and what that means is that there's 255 different levels of red, green, and blue. That's what this area right here means. If I move my mouse into this black area, let me try to get really close to the center. Yep, the lowest it's going to go is 2. I don't have anything that's like full on black. Let me just use another brush right there. There we go. So now that I've clicked it a couple more times, I have a true 0 black. Okay, so I basically have 255 different levels of white, and then, or 256 different levels from 0 full black to white, which is full white. Okay, so there's 255 different combinations of that. Now, that might seem like a lot, but if I do 256 times 256 times 256, so this will give me about 16 million different color combinations. That's what an 8-bit image, 16.7 million different colors that we can choose from. And that, again, it seems like a lot, but it really isn't a lot. When you look at images and depth of color in them, sometimes you want more. And that number here, this 8-bit, that's what that's telling us, is that there is 16 million colors, basically. Now, if we look at where that comes from, so 8 times 8 is 64, times 8, oops, wait, sorry, doing the wrong thing. So this is basically 2 times 2 times 2, so this is 2 to the 8th power. There we go, is 256. So that's where we get that 256 number. Now, when you look at a 16-bit or a 32-bit, that just multiplies the amount of colors. This is like billions of colors here, and this is quadrillions or bugzillions of colors. Insane amounts. Now, again, you might think, okay, well, I want to work with the most colors available. Okay, again, not always. Depending on what we're doing, we may only need 8-bit. And for most of the stuff we're going to do for this class, we're going to need 8-bit only. Okay, it's only when we get into some of the high-end stuff that we venture into 16 or 32-bit. Okay, so for now, we're going to just make 600 pixels by 500 pixels is fine. Resolution's 300, that's fine, and then 8 bits. RGB, white, great. All right, so going through this list, we have a different way we can kind of show off the toolbox depending on what you want to set up. I typically will leave it like this, but depending on my resolution, I may lower it or depending on what I'm working on. I use the hotkeys for everything that I can. If I forget a hotkey, I'll jump over there and try to get it. But I'm going to go with B to grab the brush. And I'm going to make sure that I have a color picked here, and then I can just start to draw stuff. Okay. Now, as a default, I'm drawing on the background layer. The background layer only allows me to draw on this one layer. I can't move it. I can't erase it. I don't have any transparency on this. If I drew something else, I'm going to just pick a different color up here. And I did this. And let's say I wanted the black to be on top of the red. I can't just automatically have it pop up there. It just won't do that. So I'm going to hit undo. So Control Z, Control Z. New to Photoshop 2019 is that your undos are not limited to one. So you can hit Control Z several times and it'll continuously do that. So I'm going to click down here to make a new layer. And if I click this red, and I just drew a red shape, click another new layer, draw a shape. Okay, and the black is on top of the red, but now I have the ability to move these layers around. Okay, I can also double click on the word layer and give it a name, red stroke. Double click the layer 2, black stroke. We can also change things like the opacity of a layer. So if I go to the opacity of this black layer and I slide it down, you can see I can change the opacity of it. I can change the fill, which is going to be, in this case, it's still the opacity. I can double click next to it. I'll bring up a layer styles box, which allows me to do things like glow. Where's glow? Outer glow, where are you at? There you are. Now, we're not going to really see it too much on this one because it's black already, so let's cancel that. I'm going to go to this background. I'm going to fill it with the foreground color, sure. Then I'm going to go to this red stroke and go to outer glow, go to opacity, and you can see this glow kind of coming in. Okay, and depending on obviously what my settings are, will dictate what that glow is going to look like. I can pick different colors and so on. Okay, and then here's the glow. Now you'll see with this, I have an eyeball for the layer, I have an eyeball for the effect, and I have an eyeball for this outer glow. In case I had another effect on here, let's say color overlay, and I chose green, you'll see that each one of these has their own little eyeball. So I can choose one off, the other one off, put them both off, put the layer off, or so on. I can still move these things up and down, and I can also drag the effect from one to the other. Okay, so you'll see that as a huge thing in Photoshop, where the ability to kind of move stuff around is going to be a key task to have. I can shift click both layers, hit this trash can, and now they both will go away after I hit go away. Make another new layer. I'm going to switch to the white. Now, again, if I can use a hotkey, I'll use a hotkey. This little arrow here, you'll see at the far right of that it says X. So if I hit X, it automatically switches between the two colors. If I right click, this will also bring up my brush settings that I'm using. So I'm going to make this a harder brush. I'm going to take the size down. I'm going to switch to my tablet. I'm not really enjoying that. There we go. Alright, so now I've created a brush and I can do that kind of thing. Okay, so now let's take a look at this a little bit more in depth in Photoshop. So we have this brush, obviously. We'll get into what a lot of these other tools are going to be used for as well. But right now we just need to focus on that one brush and some of the stuff that's going to happen. So I'm going to make 3 different layers, one at a time. So my first brush, or my first layer, I'm going to make a red circle. So I'm going to make this pretty big. I'm just going to do that. Big red blotch. I'm going to make another new layer, and I'm going to switch to green. So I'm going to take the red off. You'll see inside Photoshop there's several different ways to choose colors. There's this one, which is the HSB, which is hue, which is the color, saturation, which is the purity of the color, and the brightness, which is the darkness or brightness of that color, okay? Right now I'm using this RGB because I want to type in the exact green value. So 0 was red, that was already set up. 255 was green, that's what I'm going with. And then I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm just going to do another green swatch. Make another new shape. Go to the blue, type in 255 here, type in 0 for the green, hit OK, and then do that. All right, so click that off. This is what our image is made up of, red, green, and blue. So every one of our pixels in an RGB image is red, green, or blue. If I zoom in right here where these things kind of blend together, you'll see that even though we've painted with pure red, green, and blue, that we do get this kind of transition between all of these. And that's just part of how Photoshop works. Even with 100% opacity, I guess my hardness wasn't all the way up, but even with that all the way up, we would still get some level of blending inside there, okay? If I go over here to this and I change this to an add, and I go to my green, I change that to an add. I go to my red, I change that to an add. And I turn my background off. You will see how these blend together. I'm going to hit V to get to my, I'll try to hit V. Yeah, it's V. Why aren't you working? Oh, I click on it, it doesn't want to work. I'm going to move this red one over. I'm going to grab the green one, move the green one over, and you'll see now how the red and green, when they come together, they're making the yellow. When the red and the blue come together, they're making this magenta. The green and the blue come together, they're making the cyan. When all of them come together, they're making white. Okay. Now this is where it's different than when you print, because if I'm printing and I were to combine red, green, and blue, I wouldn't get white. I would get some kind of murky brown, blackish color. This is an additive screen process. Where it's adding these colors up to get to the white, where on a printer we would use a different mode, okay? I'm just going to delete this from the blue. Oops. All right, that little blue, I guess it's on the red. Somehow I have a blue swatch on there. There we go. So these are adding all the colors in here to get white, where in the real world, if we added the colors together, we would get, obviously, a dark color. So that's where the coloring is different versus on the regular screen. Now all that we're doing here, if I were to go to my eyedropper, I'm going to hit I for this, and I move my mouse over this area, you'll see over here in the info palette how we get different information, okay? So if I were to hold down shift and click, that will leave a little marker right there that I could always pull from if I need to. Control click, move it around if I need to, just drop it off. But as I drag this over, you can see the blending. So this is 0, 255, 0. This is both 255 in red and green. This is 255 here. Here's the red and blue mix. Here's that. There's this one. And then there's that. So you can see how these are mixing those colors together. And as weird as it might sound, but this is how Photoshop works. This is what's going to make us able to do all the stuff that we're going to be able to do. And understanding how these things function and put all this stuff together will help us out as we start building our stuff. When I'm in here and I'm using all my stuff inside Photoshop, you can see all of these different layers that are here that make this. Without any of this stuff, this looks pretty boring. That's what it looks like. As I start adding stuff to this, I'm able to create a different look to it. And all it is manipulating the red, the green, and the blue. So you don't need to create that, but I just want you to obviously see it. These things here too, as this is going into an add, it's literally just adding the color from one layer to the next layer and then the next one to the next one. Okay. So that's what the layers are using. I'm just going to draw a shape right here. Now, oops, sorry, let me jump back to that. I'm going to go to the channels here. That's what I want to show next. And the channels are basically showing us what each one of the channels are doing. So red, green, and blue in this image is not actually made up of red, green, and blue. In Photoshop, I'll turn these eyeballs off, it's using white. So in the blue channel, we're getting this white area. In the green channel, we're getting the white area. And when we put those into Photoshop and it starts to decipher what these mean, then we're getting this blending of color. Okay, so even though we might be looking at color in Photoshop, we're actually dealing with black and white imagery. And you'll see later on where that really comes into effect and how we use our stuff. We also have properties here. So any kind of thing that we're doing, let's say there we go. I move this around, you can see that it's adjusting those properties. We also have tools at the top, so if I say auto select layer, it'll automatically select the layer and then I can move it around. If this is off, then I have to click on that blue layer and then move it, click on the green layer and then move it, click on the red layer and then move it. Okay. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. Let me give these names, red. There we go. I can also grab all three of these and hit this folder and group those together. Okay, so briefly we've talked about the channels and layers, properties and info. We've talked about this bar at the top here. Under image, we have a bunch of different image settings, right? So at the start of this, we created a new image and we gave it that setting. Under this image size, these are those settings again. And you'll see that it automatically defaulted to inches here, where I could obviously switch it back to pixels and change what these things are looking like. If I change anything though, I'm going to click this lock off. You'll see that it automatically squishes those. Because in this case, it's actually just going to take the image and reshape it, you really have to be careful as to how you do this kind of stuff because of what it's going to do. Now, let's say that I increase the resolution on this tremendously. I'm going to hit OK. Now I'm going to zoom out. Now it looks pretty similar. As I get in here though, I'll actually start to see a bit of noise. And it might not be totally apparent on the screen. I'm going to go and add a levels to this so we can see it a little bit better. Well, apparently not there. Let's drag this down to the red. There we go. Come on. Why aren't you doing stuff? There we go. All right, so now you can see this kind of like noisy type stuff happening inside here. Mostly I'm kind of looking at this edge, where this edge doesn't look nice and smooth anymore because of how we've done this. Versus if I were to go in with my brush, make a new layer. Make a new layer. What's wrong with you today? Okay, make my brush huge. Hold down the Alt key and click on the red to grab that color. Okay, so now if I were to zoom in, you can see how nice and clean this edge is. Okay, so as we start scaling things up and shrinking things down, we do lose quality setting. I'm going to take this image, which is 1920, and I'm going to make it, just add a 0 to this. And this is going to distort the coloring in this. It's not going to be nice and smooth like I wanted it to, because it's actually going to be stretching out a lot of pixels bigger than they originally were. We can't take a small image, let's say a wallet size image, and make it huge and maintain the quality. We will lose quality. So anytime we work on stuff, we want to work at the same resolution that we're going to be working with until the end, or lower. So we could work on something huge and then make it smaller, that's not a big deal. But if we work on something small and try to make it huge, it's typically not going to work out very good. So you can see this. It's very grainy and kind of like gross in a lot of these areas, especially right there. You can see a lot of like squares all over the place. Now let me hit undo. And I'm just going to copy everything. So I'm going to hit Control A to select the entire screen, Control Shift C to grab everything. I'm going to Control V to paste it here, and you'll see how tiny it is. And I'm going to hit Control T and scale this up. I don't know why it's there. Let's just move this up here. Okay, make this bigger. Okay, so I've scaled this up so that it's huge, so it fills inside this area. And again, we'll see the same kind of thing where even though we've scaled this up in this document, we're going to still get that same kind of distorted ugliness. And you'll see the transform is actually taking a minute to calculate its stuff. All right, so now it's done calculating. So let's zoom in on that. And again, we're going to see that same disgustingness happening around here. Where if we go to the original one and we zoom in, we see pixels, yes, but this was never meant to be that big. You see my zoom at the top is 1070. This is not meant to be zoomed in that much. And any image you can zoom in, too far and see that stuff. This is 100%. So at this level, I should see nice smooth edges, which is exactly what I see, okay? So we have to be careful we don't scale things up too much or scale things down. Scaling things down obviously is not a huge deal unless we mean to scale them back up later. Okay, so let me just close this document, don't need it, and I'll close that document. All right, so I'm going to go back to another new document. Just make this 600 by 600 is fine. All right. And then you'll see that my brushes are also responding to this. These numbers here, 45, that's 45 pixels is what that means. So 45 pixels in this document is going to be a lot different than 45 pixels in another document. Now let's look at this too. As I use my brush and I zoom in here, you'll see that there is some kind of jaggediness to that. And part of this comes from my brush itself. Part of it could come from the speed of the computer. This was a 600 by 600 document. I'm going to make a 6000 by 6000 document. You'll see that my cursor, same size, 45, is now super small. Okay, and it looks like this is a lot smoother, but it just has to do with the fact that I'm using this smaller brush on a higher resolution canvas. Now if I make the brush bigger, I'm at 8%, where this is 109%. Let me zoom in. Okay, now we'll start to see this kind of bumping, and this is part of my brush settings. So one of my brush settings is spacing, 25%. So it's actually putting I'm going to do this kind of rough, a stamp, and then a stamp, and then a stamp, and that's how it's getting this brush right there. Okay, lowering the spacing on this. You can see I can get a much smoother result. So you have to be aware of all these different settings because it could mean your ability to create a nice smooth line that you have for a character versus this disgusting kind of bumpy, lumpy line, which you wouldn't obviously want. Okay. Oops. All right, so I'm going to leave the Photoshop basics here, just creating some layers, understanding where some of that is. We'll obviously get more into Photoshop and all the stuff that we're going to be doing in it. I will show one more thing though that I want to show, which was this is a 32-bit image. So when I come in here with my info, you'll see we still have these numbers of 0 way over here in the black area to 255 in the white area, but there's a lot more detail that's happening here. If I were to go in here to these layers and I hit Control E, that flattens it into one solid layer. And then I went into this, I went to the 32-bit exposure. I have a lot more detail that I could pull up and pull out of this. Okay, where something like that as an 8-bit I wouldn't be able to do. And then the last thing I'm going to show is our file type. So I'll save this as. Inside of a 32-bit image, we're limited to what we can save our stuff as because these are the only 32-bit image types. I'm going to hit cancel. I'm going to open up one of our drawing ones. I'm going to go to Save As. And in here, this is an 8-bit image. You get all these different formats. We want to save all of our work, every single piece of our work, as a PSD. Some of our stuff we may save additionally as a JPEG, but everything needs to have a PSD. This means that we have layers. So all the layers that we would create over here on the side, we get to save those. Okay? If I saved any one of these as a regular JPEG, and then I don't know why that shrunk. And then I reopened that JPEG, you'll see that all the layers are gone. So if I needed to edit one of the layers, I can't edit that layer anymore. Okay? It's a smaller file size. We don't want to save it as a JPEG though. Like I said, some of the stuff we will, additionally as a JPEG, but for now we're saving everything as a straight up PSD unless otherwise specified. All right? So that should give you a good introductory to the interface by watching this and then going through the video I just talked about. And then you can start right on that first assignment if you're done with everything else. So have fun. Play with it a lot because it is an awesome piece of software. And I think the class will be really fun if you do.